Italy, 1944. A dusty road somewhere between Anzio and Rome. American military police stop a group of soldiers for a routine inspection. These MPs have seen everything during this war. They have confiscated German Lugers hidden in boots, golden watches stripped from enemy officers, even diamonds sewn into jacket linings. War turns ordinary men into magpies, and the MPs know exactly where to look. But on this particular afternoon, they find something that makes even these hardened veterans step back in genuine horror. One of the soldiers carries a small leather pouch tied to his belt. It looks like a tobacco bag, unremarkable and worn. The MP demands to see its contents. The soldier shrugs. He does not resist. He does not even seem concerned. When the pouch opens, there is no gold inside. There are no watches. There are no diamonds. Instead, the bag contains approximately a dozen dried human ears. The MPs freeze. They know exactly which unit these men belong to. The red arrowhead patch on their shoulders tells the whole story. These are soldiers from the 1st Special Service Force. The Germans call them the Black Devils. The Americans call them something else entirely. They call them those crazy Canadians, even though half the unit technically holds American citizenship. But everyone who has fought alongside these men knows the truth. The Canadians set the tone. The Canadians established the rules. And those rules exist far beyond anything written in the Geneva Convention. The soldiers are not arrested. They are not court-martialed. They are released back to their unit without so much as a formal reprimand. Because in 1944, the Allied High Command needs monsters more than it needs gentlemen. And the 1st Special Service Force delivers monsters by the platoon. But how did the army of democracy, the arsenal of freedom, the great crusade against fascism, end up creating a unit that collected human body parts like trophies? How did soldiers from Canada, the land of maple syrup and excessive politeness, become the most feared fighters on the entire Western Front? The answer lies not in some dark conspiracy, but in a simple miscalculation. The brass wanted super soldiers. They got something far more dangerous. They got hunters, who finally found prey worthy of their skills. And this nightmare began with a truly insane idea hatched in the mind of a British inventor who had never fired a weapon in combat. The year was 1942, and the Allies were losing the war on almost every front. German submarines strangled Atlantic shipping lanes. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable in Russia. Japan conquered territory faster than cartographers could update their maps. In this desperate hour, a man named Jeffrey Pike walked into the offices of Combined Operations with a proposal so audacious that it bordered on clinical insanity. Pike wanted to create a unit of elite commandos who would parachute into Nazi-occupied Norway. Their mission would involve destroying hydroelectric plants and industrial facilities that powered the German war machine. The soldiers would ski through Arctic wilderness, strike without warning, then vanish into frozen mountains where no conventional army could follow. Pike called this scheme Project Plough. The British military establishment called it completely mad. But Lord Mountbatten, never one to dismiss theatrical ideas, loved it immediately. There was only one problem. Britain had no soldiers trained for this kind of warfare. The country simply lacked men who could survive in Arctic conditions while simultaneously conducting sabotage operations behind enemy lines. Norway in winter meant temperatures of 40 degrees below zero. It meant blizzards that could bury a man in minutes. It meant terrain so hostile that even the local population avoided venturing far from settlements during the dark months. Mountbatten knew exactly where to find such men. He picked up the telephone and called North America. The request landed simultaneously in Washington and Ottawa. Both governments saw an opportunity. The Americans needed a way to dispose of their most troublesome soldiers, the brawlers and insubordinates who clogged military prisons and disciplinary barracks across the country. The Canadians, by contrast, saw a chance to prove their worth to skeptical American allies. The two nations would contribute equally to this new unit. Approximately 800 men from each country would form the core of the 1st Special Service Force. But here is where the crucial difference emerged. The difference that would transform this unit from a mere commando force into a legend whispered in terror across German front lines. The Americans sent their problems. Men who had been arrested for assault, men who had threatened officers, men who preferred fists to following orders. These were not cowards. They were fighters, undoubtedly brave, but fighters without discipline or direction. The U.S. Army saw Project Plow as a convenient garbage disposal for human beings it could not control through normal channels. Canada took exactly the opposite approach. The Canadian military scoured its ranks for the absolute elite. They recruited men from the Rockies who had spent entire winters trapping animals in conditions that would have hospitalized ordinary soldiers within hours. They found lumberjacks from British Columbia who could move through dense forest without making a sound. They selected hunters from the Northern Territories who understood how to track prey across distances that seemed impossible. And they identified soldiers of indigenous heritage who carried generations of wilderness knowledge encoded in their very bones. The Canadian contingent arrived at Fort Harrison, Montana in July of 1942. They were dirty, quiet, and deeply unimpressed by their new American barracks mates. The Americans arrived drunk, loud, and convinced that they would teach these polite Canucks how real soldiers behaved. The first week produced more fistfights than the average maximum security prison. And yet something strange happened during those early months. The Americans quickly discovered that these quiet Canadians possessed skills that no amount of basic training could replicate. One sergeant from Alberta demonstrated how to gut a deer in under 3 minutes using only a belt knife. A corporal from Saskatchewan showed his tent mates how to start a fire in driving rain without matches. A private from Manitoba explained with chilling matter-of-factness how to approach a sleeping target without waking anyone in the surrounding area. The Americans had attitude. The Canadians had technique. When these two elements combined, they created something the modern world had never seen. They created the prototype for every special operations unit that would follow. Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Delta Force, JTF-2. Every single one of these legendary formations traces its DNA directly back to the muddy training grounds of Fort Harrison, Montana, where Canadians taught Americans how to become hunters of men. But the training these men received went far beyond wilderness survival. The curriculum at Fort Harrison explicitly rejected every principle of honorable warfare. Instructors taught soldiers how to approach enemy sentries from behind and eliminate them without any chance of resistance. They demonstrated techniques for clearing buildings where every room might contain armed opponents. They explained exactly how to use darkness as a weapon, how to create psychological terror that would break an enemy's will before any actual fighting began. The centerpiece of this training was a weapon that embodied the entire philosophy of the 1st Special Service Force. It was called the V-42 Stiletto, and it remains one of the most sinister instruments ever issued to any military force in history. The V-42 was not a combat knife in any traditional sense. It was a specialized instrument designed for one purpose only. The blade measured approximately 7 inches in length, with a needle-sharp point that could penetrate a human skull without significant resistance. The double-edged design allowed for cutting motions in any direction,
The handle featured a heavy pommel that functioned as a secondary weapon for crushing blows. And the crossguard was sharpened so that even blocking a strike could result in severed fingers. Regular army soldiers received bayonets. Rangers received combat knives. The 1st Special Service Force received tools that belonged in horror films rather than military arsenals. The instructors demonstrated exactly how to use these weapons. They showed recruits the precise angle required to pierce the soft tissue beneath an enemy's chin and reach the brainstem. They explained how to sever the carotid artery so quickly that a victim would lose consciousness before having any chance to cry out. They taught movements that had been perfected not in military academies, but in slaughterhouses, where speed and efficiency meant the difference between profit and bankruptcy. The Canadian soldiers adapted to this training with disturbing ease. For them, the techniques felt strangely familiar. Approaching a deer in the forest required exactly the same patience as approaching an enemy sentry. The quick, decisive cut that ended an animal's suffering differed very little from the quick, decisive cut that ended a human life. They had spent years learning how to take life cleanly and efficiently. The only change involved the species of their target. The American soldiers watched their Canadian counterparts with a mixture of admiration and genuine unease. These quiet men from north of the border did not boast about their skills. They did not swagger or threaten or posture. They simply demonstrated, again and again, that they understood violence on a level that made the American brawlers look like amateurs playing at war. One American sergeant later recalled his first impression of the Canadian contingent. He described them as the quietest and most terrifying men he had ever encountered. When they looked at you, he said, you got the distinct feeling they were calculating exactly how long it would take to end your life if the situation ever required it. And the truly unsettling part was that they seemed to perform these calculations automatically, like breathing or blinking, without any conscious effort whatsoever. By late 1942, the 1st Special Service Force had completed its transformation. The Norwegian mission had been cancelled due to shifting strategic priorities, but the unit remained intact. The brass had invested too much money and effort to simply disband these highly trained soldiers. Besides, everyone recognized that something special had emerged from the Montana wilderness, something that could not be easily replicated or replaced. The decision was made to deploy the unit to the Mediterranean theater. The first combat assignment would be a frontal assault on a German-held position that had already defeated multiple conventional attacks. Monte la Difensa, a mountain fortress in southern Italy, had repelled every Allied attempt to capture it. German engineers had spent months transforming natural rock formations into an impenetrable defensive network. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Artillery spotters could call down fire on any movement within miles of the summit. Conventional military wisdom held that the position could only be taken through a prolonged siege that would cost thousands of Allied lives. The 1st Special Service Force received different orders. They would climb the mountain at night, using routes that German planners had dismissed as impossible. They would reach the summit before dawn and eliminate the defenders before reinforcements could respond. They would do in one night what the regular army had failed to accomplish in weeks of conventional fighting. On the 3rd of December, 1943, approximately 600 men began their ascent. The climb took more than 8 hours. Soldiers pulled themselves up sheer cliff faces using ropes anchored by advance scouts. They moved in complete silence despite carrying full combat loads. Anyone who dislodged a rock or made any noise received immediate glares from the Canadians, who seemed personally offended by the concept of stealth failure. The attack began at exactly 0600 hours. The German defenders had no warning. Sentries were eliminated so quickly and quietly that their relief guards found only bodies when they arrived for the scheduled watch change. Within 2 hours,
Monte la Difensa belonged to the 1st Special Service Force. The Germans lost approximately 150 soldiers in the engagement. The FSSF suffered fewer than 70 casualties. But the numbers tell only part of the story. Reports from German prisoners captured during the battle reveal something far more significant than casualty statistics. The prisoners described an attack that felt supernatural. They spoke of black-faced figures appearing from impossible directions. They mentioned comrades who simply vanished during the fighting, found later with their throats cut, sometimes arranged in deliberately horrifying positions, as warnings to whoever discovered them. They used a specific German word to describe their attackers. They called them Schwarze Teufel, the Black Devils. The name would follow the 1st Special Service Force for the remainder of the war, and the Germans had excellent reasons for choosing it. The capture of Monte la Difensa announced to the world that a new kind of soldier now operated on European battlefields. But this was merely an appetizer. The main course would be served at a place called Anzio, where the 1st Special Service Force would transform psychological warfare into an art form that still influences military doctrine today. The Anzio beachhead represented one of the most frustrating strategic situations of the entire Italian campaign. Allied forces had landed successfully in January of 1944, hoping to outflank German defensive lines and accelerate the advance toward Rome. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a narrow perimeter, unable to break out, continuously pounded by German artillery, dying by inches in muddy trenches that recalled the worst nightmares of the previous World War. The front lines at Anzio were close enough that opposing soldiers could hear each other coughing. German and Allied positions sometimes sat fewer than 100 meters apart. During daylight hours, any movement drew immediate sniper fire. Men learned to stay in their holes, to relieve themselves without standing, to eat cold rations because smoke from cooking fires attracted artillery. It was siege warfare in its most primitive form, a return to conditions that military theorists had confidently declared obsolete. The regular infantry units hated Anzio, with a passion that bordered on insanity. Morale collapsed. Soldiers developed psychological conditions that would later be recognized as combat stress disorder. Some men simply stopped functioning, unable to face another day of random destruction from shells that could arrive without any warning whatsoever. The 1st Special Service Force viewed Anzio differently. Where others saw a death trap, they saw an opportunity. The unit established itself on the far right of the Allied perimeter, a sector that regular infantry had abandoned as indefensible. The terrain was flat and exposed during daylight, offering no natural cover. German observation posts could see every movement. Logic suggested that holding this position would require massive casualties. Instead, the FSSF suffered remarkably few losses, while inflicting catastrophic damage on the opposing German forces. The secret lay in their complete rejection of daytime operations. When the sun rose, the Black Devils disappeared into their holes and became invisible. When the sun set, they owned the night. Every evening, as darkness fell across the Anzio plain, patrols from the 1st Special Service Force slipped through gaps in the wire and infiltrated German positions. They did not come to capture territory. They did not come to gather intelligence. They came exclusively to hunt. The techniques they employed went far beyond anything covered in standard military training manuals. Soldiers blackened their faces with shoe polish and wrapped their equipment to eliminate any sound. They removed their boots and moved in stocking feet when approaching enemy positions. They communicated using hand signals developed during training, never speaking above the faintest whisper, and when they found their targets, they used the V-42 Stilettos that had become the signature weapons of the unit. German soldiers began finding the bodies of their comrades each morning. The circumstances of these discoveries followed a disturbing pattern. Sentries were found at their posts with their throats cut, sometimes still holding their rifles. Sleeping soldiers woke to find that the man in the next bed had been silently eliminated during the night. Officers discovered that someone had entered their bunkers while they slept and left without taking anything except the life of whoever had been unlucky enough to remain awake. But the physical elimination of enemy soldiers represented only half of the psychological campaign. The 1st Special Service Force understood something that military planners had largely ignored. They understood that terror could be manufactured, packaged, and delivered like any other weapon, and they became masters of this particular craft. After each raid, the FSSF soldiers left calling cards on the bodies of their victims. These cards bore the unit insignia, a red spearhead, along with a message in German. The words read, Das dicke Ende, kommt noch. The translation carries a deliberately ominous tone. It means, the worst is yet to come. The Germans found these cards pinned to corpses. They found them nailed to walls inside their own bunkers. They found them placed in locations that should have been completely secure. In headquarters buildings, in supply depots, even in field hospitals where wounded soldiers recovered from their injuries. The message was unmistakable. Nowhere was safe. The Black Devils could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. German commanders responded by issuing warnings about the unit opposing them. These warnings, captured after the war, described the FSSF in remarkable terms. They identify the soldiers as a special force composed of former convicts and wilderness experts who operate entirely outside normal military conventions. They advise German troops to never surrender to this unit under any circumstances. And they contain a fascinating detail that reveals just how effective the psychological campaign had become. The warnings suggest that German soldiers shoot themselves rather than fall into the hands of the Black Devils, because the Canadians and Americans of the FSSF were known to do things to prisoners that made quick self-elimination seem merciful by quote. Comparison. How much of this reputation was earned and how much was manufactured? The historical record suggests a disturbing answer. It suggests that both components played significant roles. The official policy of the 1st Special Service Force regarding prisoners remained ambiguous throughout the unit's existence. Commanding officers publicly insisted that all Geneva Convention protocols be followed, but these same officers showed remarkable disinterest in investigating reports that prisoners frequently failed to reach rear areas. Patrol reports consistently listed enemy eliminated rather than captured. Soldiers who discussed these matters after the war often fell silent or changed the subject when asked direct questions about prisoner handling. And then there were the souvenirs. The incident at the beginning of this account, the American MPs discovering the pouch of dried human ears, was not an isolated case. Multiple witnesses reported similar collections among FSSF soldiers. Some men kept ears, others collected different body parts. The practice drew directly from indigenous hunting traditions where taking portions of prey served as proof of a successful hunt. For the Canadian trappers and hunters, who made up much of the unit's backbone, the transition from animal trophies to human trophies required only a small psychological adjustment. Commanding officers knew about these practices. They had to know. The collections were not hidden. Soldiers displayed them openly, sometimes comparing sizes and quantities with the pride of fishermen measuring their catches. Yet no disciplinary action appears in any surviving record. The brass needed effective soldiers more than they needed soldiers who followed rules. The Black Devils delivered results. Everything else could be overlooked.
German morale in the sectors opposing the FSSF collapsed completely by spring of 1944. Prisoners taken by other Allied units revealed the extent of psychological damage. German soldiers reported being unable to sleep, terrified that they would never wake up. They described elaborate warning systems involving tin cans and tripwires that failed to provide any sense of security. They admitted to shooting at shadows, at sounds, at anything that moved in darkness, wasting ammunition and revealing their positions to FSSF scouts who noted these locations for future visits. One German officer captured during the breakout from Anzio provided testimony that summarizes the effectiveness of the Black Devil's psychological campaign. He stated that his men were not afraid of American artillery or British tanks. They were not even particularly concerned about air attacks, which could be survived with proper shelter. What destroyed them, what broke them completely, was the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness, men with blackened faces and sharp knives were watching and waiting. His soldiers could endure anything except that constant, grinding terror. The Allied High Command noticed these results. Intelligence officers documented the collapse of German morale in FSSF sectors. Staff planners began requesting the unit for other operations, recognizing that its presence alone could destabilize enemy defenses. The Black Devils had become a strategic asset far beyond their actual numerical strength. But success brought scrutiny, and scrutiny revealed uncomfortable truths about how the unit achieved its remarkable record. Other Allied formations began refusing to serve alongside the 1st Special Service Force. British officers complained about the wild colonial behavior of the Canadian contingent. American commanders worried about the influence these soldiers might have on conventional troops. Reports circulated about FSSF soldiers engaging in looting, about destruction that exceeded military necessity, about behavior toward enemy prisoners and civilians that could not be officially acknowledged. The tension came to a head during the advance toward Rome. The FSSF was assigned to capture key positions that would allow conventional forces to enter the city. They performed this mission with typical efficiency, eliminating German resistance in a series of night operations that left defending units shattered. But reports from the captured areas disturbed even battle-hardened Allied officers. Bodies were found, arranged in deliberately theatrical positions. German equipment was destroyed beyond military necessity, as though the attackers had taken personal pleasure in demolition. Local civilians described Allied soldiers who behaved more like raiders from medieval history than representatives of democratic nations. One Italian farmer told investigators that he initially believed the liberators were actually German punishment squads, because he could not imagine Americans or Canadians acting with such calculated brutality. None of these reports resulted in official action. The war was reaching its decisive phase. Rome fell in June of 1944. The FSSF participated in the liberation, marching through streets where crowds celebrated their arrival. Nobody in those cheering masses knew about the methods that had made this victory possible. Nobody asked where the German defenders had gone, or what had happened to them in the darkness before dawn. But the leadership of the Allied forces had seen enough. The 1st Special Service Force had served its purpose. Now it had become a liability. The unit was disbanded on the 5th of December, 1944, almost exactly 2 years after its first combat operation at Monte la Difensa. The official explanation cited administrative convenience. American and Canadian soldiers would be reassigned to their respective national forces. The mixed command structure had always created bureaucratic complications. Disbandment simply made sense from an organizational perspective. The real reasons were never officially stated, but everyone who understood the situation recognized the truth. The Black Devils had become too effective, too famous, and far too dangerous to control. They had accomplished everything asked of them and more. But in doing so, they had demonstrated that the fine line between soldier and something else entirely could be crossed under the right circumstances. They had proven that modern warfare could create units that resembled hunting packs more than military formations. And this knowledge made the brass profoundly uncomfortable. The surviving members of the 1st Special Service Force returned to their respective nations and largely disappeared from public view. Some attempted to describe their experiences but found civilian audiences unable or unwilling to comprehend what they had witnessed and done. Others never spoke about the war at all, carrying their memories in silence until they carried them to the grave. But the legacy of the Black Devils proved impossible to suppress. American military planners studied the unit's methods and incorporated them into the training programs of newly formed Special Operations Forces. The Green Berets, established in the 1950s, drew directly from FSSF doctrine. Navy SEAL training includes techniques that trace back to the Montana Hills, where Canadians taught Americans how to hunt. The entire modern special operations community owes its existence to the experiment that began with Project Plow and ended in the ruins of Nazi-occupied Europe. Canada, for its part, rarely discusses this chapter of its military history. The national myth emphasizes peacekeeping, politeness, and international cooperation. The image of Canadian soldiers collecting human ears as trophies does not fit comfortably within this narrative. School children learn about Vimy Ridge and Juno Beach, about sacrifice and valor. They do not learn about the techniques that made the 1st Special Service Force the most feared unit on the Western Front. Yet the truth persists in military archives, in the testimonies of survivors, and in the nightmares of German veterans who faced the Black Devils and lived to tell their stories. Canada sent its best hunters to Europe. It trained them to hunt the most dangerous prey of all. And when the hunting was done, these men brought back trophies that would have been unimaginable in any context except total war. The old debates about military necessity and moral boundaries continue to this day. Modern armed forces struggle with the same questions that troubled Allied commanders in 1944. How far can soldiers be pushed before they cross into territory that cannot be recovered? What methods are acceptable when facing an enemy that has already demonstrated its own capacity for atrocity? Where exactly does the warrior end and the monster begin? The 1st Special Service Force provides no comfortable answers to these questions. The unit was simultaneously a military triumph and a moral catastrophe. It achieved objectives that conventional forces could not approach. It broke enemy resistance through methods that violated every principle of civilized warfare. It saved Allied lives by the thousands, while taking enemy lives by the hundreds. And it left behind a record that remains disturbing, no matter how it is examined. The MPS at that checkpoint in Italy understood something that historians have spent decades trying to articulate. They looked at the dried ears in that leather pouch, at the soldier who carried them without shame, at the red spearhead patch that marked him as something beyond ordinary military service. They understood that they were looking at the future of warfare, at the logical endpoint of training men to hunt other men. And they stepped back, and they let the soldier pass, because some truths are too large to be contained by military regulations. Canada gave them the skills of hunters. War gave them prey worthy of those skills. History gave them a reputation that still resonates 80 years after the last Black Devil patrol slipped through enemy lines. And the question of what they did in those dark nights, and what it cost them and their targets alike, remains one of the most uncomfortable chapters in the entire history of the Second World War. The next time someone describes Canadians as polite and peaceful, remember the leather pouch. Remember the V-42 Stiletto. Remember the cards that promised worse things to come.
And remember that nations, like individuals, contain multitudes. The same country that produces hockey players and maple syrup also produced the most feared soldiers of the 20th century. Both truths exist simultaneously. Neither cancels the other. The Black Devils earned their name. They earned it in blood, in darkness, and in terror that still echoes through military history. And somewhere in museum collections and private hands, a few leather pouches probably still exist, their contents long since turned to dust, but their meaning preserved forever. Canada gave them the skills of hunting. War gave them the hunt of their lives.